Well, it's my pleasure to introduce David, who is our next speaker on probabilistic models.
Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me here and having me. It's always a pleasure to be back in Montreal and in the university. All right, you can see my title here, Probabilistic Theories, Dilemma Inferences and Decision Making, and those are my collaborators.
It doesn't work. It's
Not responding.
I'm just clicking. Over here on this. And I'll the arrow.
Sure, I use this
Arrows.
other than that.
Yeah, you should use this.
Okay. Okay. Well, here's the summary. A new paradigm in the psychology of reasoning aims to replace the traditional attitude. The new paradigm is Bayesian. In it, the probability that conditional, if P then Q, is the conditional probability if A then C is the conditional probability of C given A. When we replace the conditional by the conditional probability, the normative theory for reasoning becomes Bayesian, and it becomes probability logic. That is what happens. We leave classical logic not totally behind, because classical logic is part of probability logic, presupposed by it, but that's what happens. Also newly stated, we have an inferentialist analysis, according to which for normal conditionals, or perhaps for all conditionals, there are different ways of formulating this, the conditional probability must be greater. The conditional probability of C given A must be greater than the probability of A. That is, for these conditionals, for supposedly acceptable conditionals, A must raise the probability of C. A must provide a reason for C that increases C. That doesn't have to hold for the new paradigm and the Bayesian approach. The probability of C given A can be high simply because C is high, with C independent of A. Now, there are problems with the traditional approach and inferentialism. So I take the Bayesian approach. I reject both the traditional approach and the inferentialist approach. My collaborators and myself. Okay, and I am going to argue the Bayesian alternative gives the best account of reasoning and decision-making, particularly of dilemma reasoning I will use as my example. I'm going to be talking about some technical matters later on if I get to them. And so I'll give you a little glimpse ahead and a kind of intuitive summary of what I'm going to say. I'm going to be making, for I hope, intuitive reasons, a use of Through the Looking Glass and Lewis Carroll. Nice examples there. And Humpty Dumpty, of course, subject of a traditional nursery rhyme, and is in Through the Looking Glass. So let's think about Humpty Dumpty for a moment. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. The title there is from the homophonic translation of Humpty Dumpty into French. It's not in Through the Looking Glass, but you could say it's in the spirit of Through the Looking Glass. Okay. Did Humpty Dumpty have a great fall? We have a question. First conditional. If he sat on the wall, he had a great fall. I'm going to call this a dependence conditional. Humpty Dumpty is a rather unsteady man, a rather clumsy person, I should say. We don't know his gender. And so he's clumsy. If he sits on the wall, as a reason for thinking he will have a fall. His sitting on the wall increases the probability that he will have a fall. Okay, no problem. It's a dependence conditional. The consequent depends on the antecedent. If he did not sit on a wall, he had a fall, right? I will call that an independence conditional. Humpty Dumpty is drunk. Whether or not he sits on the wall is of no account. If he sits on the wall, he will have a fall. If he does not sit on the wall, he will have a fall. That's called a dilemma inference. If A, then C. If not A, then C. Therefore, C. It's a classically valid inference, goes all the way back. You can find it as in classical sources. It is classically valid for the material conditional. It's valid for the suppositional conditional, which is the conditional I approach, the Bayesian conditional. It is valid for a range of conditions. But now, look at this third sentence here. If he sat on a wall, cabbages are green. Right. Now, this conditional is also an independence conditional, but there's something wrong with it. What is wrong? I've given you the uses. One has a use. Humpty Dumpty is not drunk. 2 has a use when Humpty Dumpty is drunk. 3, when is 3 used? 3 is not used. Why is that? A whole range of theories of conditionals going back to classical times will say that 3 is true. Semantically, there's nothing wrong with it. So for the material conditional, for the Stalnaker conditional, for the Lewis conditional, for the suppositional conditional, that is the probability conditional, the one I support, it's holds for all of them. For example, we know cabbages are green. Therefore, the conditional probability that cabbages are green, given that Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, is 1. Therefore, semantically, there's nothing wrong with it. But there is something wrong with it, and we find that in experiments. In experiments, you might say participants punish that conditional. They assign it a low probability. They don't like it. They don't want to accept it. 1 is fine for them. For 1, they give the conditional probability. For 2, there haven't been many experiments yet on 2. And that's something we must get on with in the psychology of reasoning. But those experiments we have suggest that 2 is okay. 3 is a problem. We need to know why. According to the inferentialists, 3 is a problem because it is false. The antecedent is irrelevant to the consequent. And that's why people don't like it. But after all, then the inferentialists have a problem with 2, because for 2, whether or not Humpty Dumpty sits on the wall is irrelevant to whether he'll have a fall because he's drunk, right? So the inferentialists have a problem with 2. Okay, so we consider these 3 hypotheses. The material conditional hypothesis, this is the hypothesis of what I'm calling the traditional psychology of reasoning. The probability of conditional is that of the material conditional, which is the same as not P. Not A or C, if A then C. And then the suppositional hypothesis, the probability of the conditional if A then C is the conditional probability of C given A. That's the I support, goes back to Ramsey and De Finetti, as you can see. And the inferentialist hypothesis, if A then C is a normal conditional or is an acceptable conditional only if A raises the probability of C. Or and so that's the probability of C given A is higher than the probability of C, or equivalently, we can express this another way. The probability of C given A is higher than the probability of C given not A. In the traditional approach, the material conditional hypothesis was proposed by Phil Johnson Laird and Ruth, who's sitting here, 1991. The suppositional conditional hypothesis goes back to Ramsey and De Finetti, as I said, and you can find a summary of this notion in these 2 sources. I've given you the references, what I've sent to the conference. And the inferentialist hypothesis has been stated by Duvin and Krupi and Yukona. They have a good summary and review of inferentialist positions going a long way back. Okay, now the material conditional hypothesis. We can be quick with this because it's no longer held by anybody in the psychology of reasoning. It's been abandoned. Suppose Humpty Dumpty's trying to decide whether to sit on the wall, right? So he knows it's a bit clumsy. He decides, it's too risky for me to sit on the wall. So, and the more he thinks about that, and the more he drinks, the more highly probable it comes that he will not sit on the wall. Therefore, the more highly probable it becomes that if he does sit on the wall, then he will not have a fall by the material conditional hypothesis. Because the material conditional hypothesis is the probability of the conditional is if A then C is the probability of not A or C. So as the probability of not A goes up, the probability of the conditional goes up. The more and more Humpty Dumpty convinces himself that he should not sit on the wall because he will fall off if he does, the more it becomes more likely it becomes true that if he does sit on the wall, he won't have a great fall. Now, and I use an example there. If we invest in this cryptocurrency scheme, our money will be safe. We decide not to invest in the cryptocurrency scheme, right? become more convinced we shouldn't because it's a scam. And if that were a material conditional, its probability would go up. And that's just. Now, Johnson Laird and his collaborators have revised his theory. As you can see in this very interesting article here, 2022, and he now holds the probability of the conditional as a conditional probability, and hence he and suppositional theorists on the same side in rejecting inferentialism. Okay, so here is the suppositional conditional, the conditional of the new paradigm, and probability of, if we invest in this scheme, then our money will be in safe hands is the conditional probability. And so, of course, as we become convinced that this scheme is a scam, this probability goes down. That's fine. That's what we want. Now, the new Bayesian paradigm in the psychology of reasoning holds that people usually make inferences from their degrees of belief and not from arbitrary assumptions. I'm going to stress this because there's been a great deal of attention, comments on the new paradigm, on the conditional, and the relation between the conditional and the conditional probability. But it's a very important element, a central element of the new approach that is about inferences from degrees of belief. As Henry was saying, reasoning is drawing a conclusion from the premises. What are the premises? In the traditional approach, the premises are assumptions. Oh, you assume, we ask participants, assume if A, then C, for modus ponens, if A, what follows? Does C follow? And they're supposed to say yes, of course, and they do, up to ceiling. I'm going to be using an example later about a pregnancy test. And Jane is trying to decide whether to take this pregnancy test or not. She thinks, if I'm pregnant, then the test will be positive, right? She wants some help. She wants some help. She'd like to work out how likely it is she's pregnant. Okay, so she comes to us and say, you know about reasoning. And in the traditional approach, she would be told, okay, if you assume that if you're pregnant, then the test will be positive, and you assume that you're pregnant, it will follow that the test will be positive. There, okay, I hope that was of some help. Goodbye. Oh, Jane's going to say, wait a minute. You were supposed to give me some help. I want to know whether I'm pregnant or not. I'm not going to get very far in life by assuming, or I can't get very far in my decision making at the moment by assuming that I'm pregnant, right? No. Okay. And on the Bayesian approach, we give her a lot of help. We say to her, look, what is your degree of belief, your conditional probability, that the test will be positive given you're pregnant? Do you know the statistics on this test you bought? I'll make a point later, very important, to look at the expiry date on a pregnancy test. Is it over the expiry date or is it not? Right? Okay, you tell us that. You tell us then the problem, your judgment, that the test will not be, that the test will be positive if you are not pregnant. And you also tell us your confidence at the moment, whether you're pregnant or not. Why do you think you're pregnant? How confident are you? You give us those things, and we'll tell you. We'll tell you how confident you should be that if the test is positive, then you're pregnant. Right? And there's no problem for us because all those conditionals are conditional probabilities, and it's all smooth. We just apply the Bayesian machinery, and she gets all the answers she wants. Right? No problem. But there will be a problem for inferentialism later. I'll show you what this is called. Okay, so I do want to stress that. As we would say in the new paradigm, we are the first truly and thoroughly psychological approach to reasoning. Why? Because psychology should be about beliefs, not about assumptions. Leave to logic the assumptions. In psychology, we are about mental attitudes. And in the psychology of reasoning, a mental attitude is a belief, a degree of belief in something, some confidence. That's what reasoning as a positive for our program. The suppositional conditional is defined as a conditional for which this relation holds. And so, as I say now, Johnson Laird and his collaborators, at least on that paper, hold that this relation is true. And so they have a kind of suppositional conditional. And it has a logic. It is not classical logic because we don't have the material conditional, we have the suppositional conditional, and its logic is probability logic. And this logic is sometimes called system P, intuitively. Okay, now a little more on inferentialism. In these papers, it is stated that a normal conditional, and sometimes the inferentialists will even talk about normal people using conditionals. The normal people use an inferentialist conditional. I think we should be pretty cautious in psychology about talking about normal. Now, for them, a conditional has to be such, if A then C, has to be such that A raises the probability of C. A provides a reason for C. And it's important to note here that you cannot have both the probability of C given A and the probability of C given not A. They cannot be both be greater than the probability of A. Yeah.
Is it P of C?
Have I made a mistake here? If A then C, the probability of C given A is greater than the probability of A.
Yeah.
Sorry, you're so right. Well spotted. This should be C. I'm so sorry. My mistake. Well spotted. I'm glad someone's paying attention. It's got to raise the probability of C. And they cannot both be greater. Probability of C given A and the probability of C given not A cannot both be greater than the probability of C. Okay, good. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry about that. Now, Johnson Laird, I was at a conference a few years ago when this view was first stated, and Johnson Laird said, yeah, but look, Igor Duvin, what about a conditional? If the company is in debt, then it is not in its books, right? The company is in debt doesn't raise the probability that it's not in its books. And it's not a reason for believing that the debt's not in the books. And Igor said, oh, no, that's not a proper conditional. That's not a real conditional. That's a highly abnormal conditional. Actually, he said it wasn't this kind of example, wasn't a conditional at all. And actually, Johnson Laird repeats this example. But here, we agree with Johnson Laird. This is a perfectly good conditional. It's not covered by inference. Okay, so okay, here I get it right. Thank goodness.
It's just fine.
Right, a dependence conditional. The probability of C given A is greater than the probability of C. It's equivalent to saying the probability of C given A is greater than the probability of C given not A. That's a dependence condition. An independence conditional such that the probability of C given A equals the probability of C. Or, and we could also say equivalent. Now, for suppositional theorists like myself, there's nothing wrong with independence conditionals. And indeed, they are of great importance, as I hope to show. For inferentialists, there's something wrong with independence conditionals. They're not really conditionals at all, or they're abnormal conditions. A normal conditional, this is my terminology, but that is what they would say. A normal conditional has to be such. The antecedent raises the probability of C. That's the reason for it. Okay, so here we have an example. Now, I'm interested in French politics, and so I read Le Monde when I can, and I quite often see in Le Monde, for an English speaker, quite surprisingly often, I would say, conditionals in this form. Actually, I've simplified this. I hope it's okay. The conditionals in Le Monde are normally more complex than this. I've simplified it. Look okay? As a French speaker? Yeah, okay. Good. Now, if you put this into Google, translate, you get back, while the prime minister is satisfied with the law, the president is not. Okay. In France, the Fifth Republic, there's a prime minister and the president. Prime minister at the moment is Sébastien Lecornu, and of course the president is Emmanuel Macron. So we're talking about two separate people here. And indeed, in elementary French, very elementary French, we're sometimes told, I was told, the elementary French, which is the only French I ever did at school, we use the while to translate such a construction. But you see, the English conditional is perfectly okay, or at least we suppositional theorists argue that the prime minister is satisfied with the law, the president is not. Now, 70 years ago, when I was 10 years old, as a matter of fact, the sort of grammar I was taught would imply that there's a problem with this, that we should only use while for a temporal element, not for a contrast. And I might have been marked down for writing this. And we should use while the prime minister has gone, is traveling to Orléans, the president is in the Élysée Palace twiddling his thumbs or something like that, for temporal. We should use whereas here in English. I think this has changed. The linguists will tell us much more about this sort of thing than I can. But I think the English is perfectly okay there, and it would always be okay. Now, you may say, oh, well, sorry.
The way I read the French sentence,
Yes.
it's saying, I read it as saying, I don't know if the prime minister is satisfied with the law or not, but I can tell you the president is not.
Okay, that's one way of reading it, certainly. Yeah. Yeah.
And for me, that's not, if I read it like this, it's not a real condition. It's just a rhetorical.
Well, you're tending more towards the inferentialist view there. It doesn't matter. You're saying, look, it doesn't matter what the prime minister's view is. The president is against them. Okay. Okay. That actually, you're not. That is what I'm calling an independence conditional is a perfectly good independence conditional. Yes. So you're siding with us, as a matter of fact. If you think that's a perfectly good condition, yeah, and that's fine. Forget the while. This means this. And they're both perfectly good. Now, you may say, well, look, these are somewhat unusual uses of the conditional. You wouldn't very often hear this in conversation in English on the Clapham omnibus. And perhaps this kind of construction is not so common in spoken French. It's certainly very common in written French, as far as I can see. Okay, but now, these independence conditionals, for the first point of my argument, they are important and they do occur. Consider concessive conditionals. Now, these are common in English and French. Certainly in English, I think in French as well. Spoken as well as written, right? Even if conditions. Even if Humpty Dumpty did not sit on the wall, he had a fall for when he's drunk. So it doesn't matter whether or not he sits on the wall, he's going to have a fall because he's drunk. So even if he did not sit on the wall, he had a fall. But look, if this conditional here, this concessive conditional, if it's to convey independence, this conditional here, which would normally be a dependence conditional, is in this context an independence conditional. And it has to be so, because otherwise you have to have both if A, then C, and if not A, then C, at a high probability for C to be independent of A, right? Okay, a basic fact about probability theory. They both have to be common for independence. Okay, and independence is really important. Ordinary reasoning. This is part of my argument, even if it's so important. Of course, we know in science, independence is important. You don't want these two conditionals to be high and equal in your experiment. It's established your experiment hasn't shown anything, right? Okay, so that's the first part of my argument, that these independence conditions are important. Now, let us come to these strange conditionals. I call them walrus conditionals. Through the looking glass. The time has come, the walrus said, to talk of many things, of shoes and ships and sealing wax, of cabbages and kings. That's where the cabbage comes from, right? So Humpty Dumpty thinks you can have a conversation by just stringing together all sorts of miscellany, unrelated topic. The conversation as far as it's concerned. No, it's not a conversation. So there's a pragmatic problem with conditionals like this. Edgington is a suppositional theorist. This is a classical article in the suppositional theory. She was the first theorist to pick these conditionals out as a problem. These, what I'm calling Walrus conditionals. It's been suggested to me by an inferentialist that they would be better called Oxford conditionals after Edgington, because Edgington was at Oxford, which she used as example, and Oxford is in it, right? In it. But I like Walrus conditionals. I'm just sticking to it. Right. And she predicted, she's not a psychologist of reasoning, she's a philosophical logician. She predicted, and I'm quoting her here, these conditionals, people will find them not acceptable or even false. So she was presupposing that there's a pragmatic problem with this condition, right? And I said, for suppositional theories. Lo and behold, nobody paid much attention to this section, this little section of Edgington's classic paper until Niels Olsen came along, et al. And Niels, to their credit, they ran an experiment for the first time on these conditionals. And they had conditionals like if Mark presses the power button, his TV turns on. Okay, that's a dependence conditional. If Mark is wearing socks, then his TV is on. If W, then T. Okay, so this is what we are calling a Walrus condition. Yeah. What happened? The conditional probability hypothesis was confirmed for these conditions. The probability of the conditional was the conditional probability. But here it wasn't true for these conditionals. The participants didn't like them, found them unacceptable. Probably false. Okay. So, to their credit, they ran this experiment. But we suppositionists argued that there's a confound here, right? They go from a pragmatically acceptable dependence conditional to a pragmatically unacceptable independence condition. So that is a confound. Totally charged. So these are Walrus conditionals. How would we unconfound the experiment? We would have, if Mark presses the power button, his TV turns on, that's the same. But we change to an independence conditional that is pragmatically acceptable. If Mark presses the power button, his TV screen is blank. Right? Okay, doesn't matter, it's independent. You see, his TV is broken. We would use this conditional. The service person arrives, what's wrong with Mark's TV? If Mark presses the power button, his screen remains blank. Okay, that has use. It tells the repair person something, right? But it's an independence condition. Screen being blank is independent of whether the power button is pressed. Now, here's this very important paper here by the linguist Dan Lasseter, now at Edinburgh University, uses the notion of pragmatic discourse coherence to explain what is wrong with Wallace conditionals. He supports that in this paper. So he unconfounds. He's produced an unconfound experiment, and with results we would predict. Experiments on Walrus conditionals give no support to inferentialism. And I just note here, these experiments are further limited, these experiments apparently in support of inferentialism, by not having a full polarity manipulation or design. The full polarity one is where you have if A then C, if not A then C, if A then not C, if not A then not C. So bring on all the negations. And these negations tend to bring with them independence conditions. Okay, that's why there's a further failure in these experiments supporting inferentialism, because they don't use a full polarity. Okay, now let us consider different kinds of nonsense. Back to through the looking glass. This use, Jabberwocky conditional or Jabberwocky sentence, does have an established use in linguistics and psycholinguistics. It is for a conditional or a sentence more generally. Actually, I don't think I've ever seen it used for a conditional, but certainly it is used for sentences that are grammatical but have meaningless words in them. Because the purpose of this is to investigate the question, is our knowledge of grammar separate from our knowledge of the meaning of words? Okay, now you call Jabberwocky. 'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave, all mimsy were the borogoves and the moan wrath outgrabe. Okay, that's the first stanza of Jabberwocky. It's grammatical. The words in it, however, are meaningless in English. They could be English words. They could be English words, but they're not. They could even be Anglo-Saxon words, but they're not. They sound like Anglo-Saxon words, but they're not. They're meaningless. Okay, so this conditional is semantically meaningless. Okay, now we have a Walrus conditional. Jabberwocky in Through the Looking Glass is called a nonsense poem. The Walrus and the Carpenter, also in Through the Looking Glass, is called a nonsense poem. But it's different. It's pragmatic nonsense, or so we argue. There are different kinds of nonsense. The Walrus says, the time has come, the Walrus said to talk of many things, of shoes and sips and sealing wax, of cabbages and kings. So why the sea is boiling hot, whether pigs have wings. See, it's pragmatic. String of unrelated topics. Why is the sea boiling hot? It's pragmatically wrong to ask a question when we already know the answer, right? Let's debate whether pigs have wings. No, it's pragmatically wrong. You can't debate. We all know pigs don't have wings, so you can't debate it pragmatically. So we suppositionists, we claim 5 and 6 are different. 5 is semantic nonsense. 6 is pragmatic nonsense. All right. But for inferentialists, they're both semantic problems. Lasseter supports suppositional. Okay, now let's look in more detail at Bayesian reasoning. We'll consider a pregnancy test. It has an expiry date. Okay, now, for this expiry date, I'm going to assume that when the test reaches the expiry date, the test produces lots and lots of false positives. Huge, randomly produces false positives. Right? Now, I know actual pregnancy tests at the expiry date, or at least the ones I've read about, tend to produce false negatives. But it's easier to understand if I express everything using positive notions, right? So I use a positive notion. We're back to Jane here in our problem, right? How do I find out whether I'm pregnant or not? Okay, so she needs a good pregnancy test, and that is one which is such that if it's within the expiry date, far from the expiry date, this probability is high and this probability is low. This conditional probability is high and this conditional probability is low. Then we need to know, of course, the probability of H, that she is pregnant. And that will depend on her age and various other factors we could name. Okay, now, what happens as this pregnancy test approaches the expiry date and reaches the expiry date? More and more false positives are produced until they happen willy-nilly. At a certain point in this progress, the inferentialist will say, if Jane is pregnant, the test will be positive. It's exactly the same as if Jane is pregnant, then raccoons have tails. Or if Jane is pregnant, then cabbages are green, right? There's no connection between the pregnancy and the result of the test. And so this is an abnormal, bad conditional, just like what they call missing link conditionals of the sort. If Jane is pregnant, then cabbages are green, or raccoons have tails. Now, for us, that's not so. For us suppositionalists, nothing happens. Nothing at all happens. All nice and smooth. As this increases, we reach the expiry date. It goes over the expiry date. These two probabilities become the same. right? And therefore, by Bayesian reasoning, the probability that she is pregnant, sorry, the probability that the test is positive, given that she's pregnant, yeah, equals the prior probability, yeah. And the probability that if the test is positive, then she is pregnant, will equal the prior probability that she's pregnant. Because we have independence here all the way around. Okay, so she knows then that the test is no good, right? It's not going to tell her anything. Whatever her prior is, or she is pregnant, it will be unaffected by the test. And that's what we tell her, right? All nice as we don't tell, oh, you've got to forget about this conditional at the moment. If you're pregnant, then raccoons have tails. It's become like that. Forget about it. No. And of course, we haven't told her, oh, well, if you just assume that you're pregnant, right? Or you just assume that the test is positive, right? Then this is no. We tell her everything she needs to know to make important decisions in her life. Okay. Yeah. I'm repeating that. I should say here, this example might remind many of you who know decision theory about the sure thing principle, the Savage sure thing principle, yeah, which allows you from if A then C, and if not A then C, to infer that you should do C. It's beyond the dilemma inference because it's like a deontic version of dilemma inference and gives advice about what you should actually do. Now, it's a further step. It's a step from the dilemma inference to the sure thing principle that brings in certain normative problems, which I'll explain later. You can ask about them. The dilemma inference is valid for the suppositional conditional, but we all agree there are certain problems with the sure thing principle because of this further step of action. Now, actually, we started a bit late. How much time have I?
10 minutes after. 10 minutes after.
I have only 10 minutes. Okay. Yeah. Oh, well, let me skip over the logic. Actually, inferentialism doesn't have a logic. I could tell you, it does not have a logic. They haven't specified it yet. But we at least know that we cannot have if A then C, and if not A then C, true at the same time. Suppositionalism has a full logic we've worked out. We haven't worked out. Dufanetti, Ramsey, and other logicians have worked out a probability logic. We know a huge amount about it. I won't stall from Dufanetti's analysis and the defective truth table, which we call the Dufanetti table. You can ask about all this if you like. And what we get out of all this is that these examples of dilemma inferences are both valid for us. When we have if A then C, if Humpty Dumpty is drunk, then he'll have a great fall. If Humpty Dumpty is not drunk, then he will have a great fall. We can infer he will have a great fall. And we can have the two premises separately. They are both valid. But for the inferentialist, there's a problem because one of these two conditionals must be false. I've already said this, or they could both be false if we are independence conditions. And therefore, the dilemma inference will be useless because the premises will never be true. Whether or not, they haven't said whether it's valid or not, because they haven't got a logic. But from their analysis, it does follow that these will be useless. Okay. The blocks problem due to Levesque, who's at philosophical logician at Toronto. This is a famous logical problem of his. And it actually has been given to participants. So we have a stack of blocks, some of which are green and some of which are not green. So going from the top to the bottom, the second block in the stack is green, and the fourth one down is not green. Is there a green stack directly on top of a non-green stack? Yes or no, I can't say. Only 10% of participants solve this problem correctly, which is the correct answer is yes, across non-constructive reasoning, right? Which I can give you here. Yeah, see, across dilemma reasoning. If the third block is green, the answer is yes. or the second block is green. The fourth block is not green. So if the third block is green, the answer is yes. If the third block is not green, the answer is yes. Yeah. Yes, both ways. Because in one case, there's a green, the second block is on top of it. In the second case, it's on top of it. Okay. So the answer is yes. So here, that's useful. You want an example of when dilemma is useful? There, it's useful. Now the more important example. Mill on liberty. Famous argument, chapter 2 for free speech. This is one of the most famous arguments in the history of political theory. Now, he wants to argue that we shouldn't silence what he calls silencing, suppressing opponents' points of view. Now, let us suppose, as background, that this view A is silenced, we've suppressed it. Mill argues, if A is true, there's a loss in utility because people don't get to hear about A, and A is true, so they would benefit from the truth. Right? And he argues, if A is false, there's also a loss in utility. Because if A is false, and we don't hear about A, then our views are not challenged. And Mill says this is a very bad thing. You have to have your views challenged. Like when we submit a paper, we've institutionalized this in science. We get peer reviews. We get our views challenged, right? We get our hypotheses and theories challenged, and that's good for us. Well, we don't always think this when we get the reviews, but generally the reviews help us. We improve. Yeah. So that is his argument. Well, translating this into the sure thing principle is a little problematic, as I say. But this is a dilemma inference, right? And the conclusion is there's a loss in utility, whether A is true or false. Okay, given the background that it is silenced. Actually, I don't have much time left. Okay. No, I've given a technical appendix there. You can use that as work through that as a. Okay, let me just finish on the sure thing principle. So according to Savage, we could have, well, let's use the pregnancy test. Savage gives an example of a businessman who's trying to decide whether or not to invest. And this businessman thinks, if the Democrat wins, I should invest. If the Democrat doesn't win, I should invest. And by dilemma inference, apparently, he infers, I should invest now. I should. It's a Dianti conclusion, and that's an action. Now, that's a step beyond dilemma, and we can see a normative problem with it if we consider the pregnancy test. Jane notices that her pregnancy test is at the expiry date. She goes off to buy another one. Okay? As she's going to the shops, a tremendous thirst comes upon her. Now, just ignore for the moment that extreme thirst is itself a symptom of pregnancy. But just to simplify things, she doesn't know that. She's not going to infer anything from it. She gets this tremendous thirst comes. So she thinks, well, look, if I sit down and have this large mineral water now, right? Then the test will be positive or not, independent. If I don't have this glass of water, right, this will be positive. So I should go and have the glass of water. That's exactly analogous to it. But you see the problem here. She's now going to drink this water. And the water will affect the pregnancy test, right? The water will dilute her urine, which will have a tendency to cause false negatives, right? So there's a problem, a normative problem with the sure thing principle that is beyond the dilemma inference. Dilemma inferences are valid, but if you take this further step of saying you should perform such and such an action, you will act in the world, and that action in the world can affect the probabilities that you've assigned to your reasoning led you to that. Okay. Yeah, and there are my conclusions. I can just leave you to read the conclusions. Then we'll have time for questions. Okay, did I do all that? Did I go? Okay, well,
Further questions, please speak as loudly as you can. And I'll repeat if needed.
Yeah.
If we can keep going on your Jane example and her pregnancy test, according to your account, is there a case where you would advise her not to take the pregnancy rather than say, well, it's irrelevant, this is the same as the probability of you are pregnant? Is there a case where you would say, actually, you should not take it because you have more chances of falsely believing you're pregnant when you're not?
Yeah. So you, when you ask a deontic question, should you actually do this? That is a further point. We can give that advice. We can say, well, look, you've drunk all this water, so you should not take the pregnancy test now because we work out all the probabilities. You've ruined the test with all this water. Or we could say, well, look, this pregnancy test is past the expiry date, so you shouldn't take it. But it's further. Okay, in our transgender age, suppose Jane is a man, right? So there's zero probability that he'll break. Should he take the test? Well, we can also say, well, actually, you know, there's you can have some utility in a man taking the pregnancy test, because if he gets a positive result, there's a chance that there's something really seriously wrong with his hormones. Right? So every once in a while, we see in the newspaper, at a drunken party, a young man has taken a pregnancy test that's been positive, has gone to the doctor, and he has testicular cancer. If there's a correlation between positive pregnancy tests and testicular cancer. Right? So when you have, should we do this? We need the full set of probabilities, the priors, the conditional probabilities, the full background. Then we can give this advice about what you should not do. But through these other approaches, the material conditional approach, I think is complete nonsense. That's the answer. If the antecedent is false, do what you like. Because all the conditionals would be true. Every single conditional. That isn't that. The inferentialists say, well, if the pregnancy test is the expiry date, the conditionals know better than if Jane is pregnant, then raccoons have tails. We can cover the full. Okay.
One of the things you said in the beginning has to do with the nature of the premises that people use.
Yeah, exactly.
And your approach is the premises.
The premises are beliefs.
The beliefs about the real world.
Exactly.
How it works, right? Some of human reasoning has to do with just make beliefs or things that are not real.
Exactly.
Even young children that reason with fantastical beliefs.
Exactly.
Two reasons.
That's a good thing too.
How does that fit in?
Okay. Well, actually, what I said was too strong. I should have, if I'd been, if my talk had been totally on the new paradigm, I would have said more. There's hypothetical reasoning, which we actually need for the Ramsey test. We need that for the right reason. But these hypotheses we do in ordinary reasoning, suppose you take the pregnancy test, right? It was in decision. We haven't done it yet. We haven't taken the test. To make the conditional probability judgments, we need these suppositions, hence the name on the hypothetical proposals. Okay. Now, okay, that is an ordinary decision making. You say, well, what about kind of like pure fantasy children engage in? Well, we sometimes engage in, right? In our private daydreaming moments, right? That can have various psychological uses and so on and so forth. But the thing is, as far as our relation to the traditional paradigm is concerned, it's not a complete rejection, unlike our complete rejection of inferentialism, because it's absorbed, it's part of it. There's no problem with making assumptions under certain circumstances. We don't reject that. You can go ahead and do it, right? And because classical logic underlies probability logic. In fact, every single inference that is valid classically, including all the inferences for the material conditional, are valid in probability logic. It's just that we have this extra condition, probability. It has no abundance in classical logic. So fine, we can make assumptions at times. It's just that, and that's why I stress, we are psychologists. It's good for logicians to just investigate assumptions and natural deduction systems and well, great. They can do that, and it's sometimes relevant in psychology, and the results, the classic results, like the belief bias results we've been hearing so much about. They're important results, there's no doubt about it. But we have a finer notion of what a belief bias is. We can specify, say, for the conclusion of modus ponens, a coherence interval. You must fall within this interval to be coherent. If A, then C, A, therefore C. Given the probabilities, the premises, the conclusion must fall within this interval. And if it's too low, that would be incoherent. And if it's too high, so we can make more distinction. There would be a kind of belief bias if people have overconfidence in their conclusions, which, believe it or not, is even possible for modus ponens. Classically, this wasn't investigated, but you can be more confident in the conclusion of modus ponens than you should be, because you have a my-side bias, so it's belief bias.
We had a question about still positive.
Yeah, you might have to raise your voice. Thanks to transatlantic flight, my hearing is particularly bad.
Thank you.
Yes.
Here they talk about conclusions. Importance for human reasoning. For XAA, for example, do you think we could explain IA without just with this kind of framework without causal models like for example? We need to
You want to use causal models to
no, not to use. Just having your point of view regarding causal models, in addition to this kind of framework, to allow explanation of IA. What do you think about that?
Okay, good, great. Now, question is, you can say to me, look, this is a good psychological question. How do you get these conditional probabilities? You could look at statistics. You could consider counterexamples. They come to mind. How often do I have A followed by C? I could have certain times A occurs without C, so that would be a counterexample. What about Bayes nets? Yes, you can have some models of Bayes nets could give you the conditional probabilities. We have, and Oxford and Chater, who are leading lights of the new paradigm, they've done a lot with these Bayes nets. And so if we represent, so the conditional probabilities could be given to us by mental kind of Bayes nets, causal nets, great. And they give us those conditional probabilities. Then once we have the conditional probabilities, they go into the Bayesian machine and out pops your answer. Does that answer your question?
Very tough and really accurate, but what has to do with causal models in addition to conditions? Is this something we talked about already that could be combined?
Yes. Well, we're certainly not rejecting dependence conditionals. And these causal models will be important for giving an account of dependence conditionals. But as you also know, these models can tell us about independence. Pearl tells us a great deal about independence, right? So they're good for the independence conditionals as well. Yes.
Provide this model, which is heavily influenced by the beliefs of such person, their own such probability. Is it possible that for someone to assess an intense belief,
yeah,
they could even create their own probabilities or an illusion of probabilities, even when the fact, let's say, is a probability of 0, but they go into such a circuit of thinking and believing to it that for them there is a possibility in them creating this such.
So you're talking about someone with restrained beliefs?
Yes, let's example of the if pregnancy test.
Yeah.
Let's say that the pregnancy test is it says no, and the Jeannette, for example, really wants to have a baby, but each time the pregnancy says no, and so she will try to argue, even here, that maybe it's always the manian that is false, or it's not working. Because you will try again until maybe one day it will finally say yes. And in that case, so even though it may never happen, she will always try to create herself a possibility that it may happen. And in that case, how do we help that person to say
Right. So this person is rather impervious to these, all this evidence. Let's say she has an extreme my side bias. Yes, indeed. How do we help these people? One whole side of my family are Trump supporting Republicans. So, I know I'll try to a point to reason with them, but when they reach for their guns, the door. Yes.
Maybe to follow up on the last questions, do you think that conditional probabilities that people can attribute generally represent the state of their knowledge, like the number of counterexamples they can think of, for example?
Yeah.
Or that it is more like an intuitive translation of strength of the cue or recency of the information or emotion behind it?
both.
I think it's the
Now, and this book I refer to over in Evans, 2024, Human Reasoning. It's a short book. You can read it. It's only 35,000 words or so. We also cover dual process theory, which we heard about this morning. And these could be system one, type one processing, quick.
availability heuristic.
Yeah. Could be heuristic, boom, 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 boom. They don't see. Traditionally, people might say, well, this is a terrible bias, right? These people just, they make these probability judgments spontaneously with the heuristic. From the Bayesian point of view, it doesn't matter where these initial judgments come from. They can be, they don't have to be based on frequencies, they're based on heuristics, rules of thumb, crude thoughts, blind prejudices. It all goes into the Bayesian mill. Of course, if then, when it all comes out, the people are not responsive to evidence, right? That's when the problem starts. That's when, okay, we say, look, we've done as much as we can. If they're not going to follow probability logic, they're just going to, right? They're going to say, well, no, we have it in for elites. We don't like all these elite doctors or elite Bayesian statisticians. We're just going to do what we.
I'm gonna take my car.
We say.
Plane accident last week.
We have an example in the book of ivermectin, right? All these Americans were very skeptical of the vaccine. They didn't want to take the vaccine. So they got it into their heads that they should take this anti-worming medicine called ivermectin. Right? It's used to treat worms in horses. Okay. Well, when it gets to that point,
I have a very elementary question.
yeah,
I think you lost me on slide 2.
I lost you on slide 2. Well, you spotted the mistake. I'm so sorry.
I was trying to just reconcile the probability of A implies C equals the conditional probability of C given A.
Yeah, when you have independence, the probability of C given A equals the probability of C. Right?
Right.
That's equivalent. That's equivalent to saying the probability of C given A is higher than the probability of C given not A. They come to the same thing. It means A increases the probability of C.
Right.
Or not. In this case, when they're equal, no. It doesn't do anything. Right? Or there's independence, so there's conditional independence. Then, given that this is conditional independence, given that Humpty Dumpty is drunk, then whether or not he sits on the wall makes no difference. It's not good. He's going to have a fall, and it doesn't increase.
I think I missed the P somewhere. That's why I could.
But well done.
You said P of A implies C equals P of C under A.
I'm sorry.
The first P.
That was totally my fault.
No. No, in my mind, I didn't read it. My mind, I didn't read it.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you very much. I want to take more.